We're coming on the air with breaking news in New York, where former President Donald Trump is about to hold what has been billed as a press conference right there at Trump Tower. It comes less than 24 hours after he became the first former president to be convicted of a crime. In a historic verdict, a jury finding Mr. Trump guilty of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to a hush money payment made to adult film star Stormy Daniels in the final weeks of the 2016 campaign. Mr. Trump already blasting the verdict, calling it a disgrace. The verdict pushing our legal and political systems into uncharted territory. A lot to play out here still, not only his sentencing, which may or may not include a prison time set for July 11th, but also how this may impact the presidential election. Notably, Mr. Trump's press conference is also set at the same place he announced his first campaign in 2016, this time under very different circumstances. Let's go to Hallie now, who is at the scene there.
Hey there, Lester. Yes, we are here in the atrium of Trump Tower. And if I look around the corner, it's because former President Trump is walking out as we speak. It is not clear at this news conference if he is set to take questions or not. We are obviously positioned. There are supporters here. You see them cheering. You hear them cheering as Mr. Trump now has appeared in this unprecedented moment, Lester. I'll toss it back to you as we hear what the former president has to say.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is a case where if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. These are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. When you look at our country, what's happening, where millions and millions of people are flowing in from all parts of the world, not just South America, from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, and they're coming in from jails and prisons, and they're coming in from mental institutions and insane asylums. They're coming in from all over the world into our country. And we have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it, because they could right now, today, he could stop it. But he's not. They're destroying our country. Our country is in very bad shape. And they're very much against me saying these things. They want to raise your taxes by 4 times. They want to stop you from having cars with their ridiculous mandates that make it impossible for you to get a car or afford a car. But make it very possible for China to build all of our cars. It's a very serious problem that we have. We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines and was threatened with jail. Think of it. I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by a lot, and I'm leading the Republicans to the point where that's over. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together, given by a court. And they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people. And maybe his people, more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything. But he's nevertheless the president, so we have to use his name. And this is done by Washington, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail. So we'll play that game a little bit longer. We won't talk about it, but you're allowed to talk about it. I hope you do, because there's never been anybody so conflicted as this. As far as the trial itself, it was very unfair. We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. He looks so nice and soft. People say, oh, he seems like such a nice man. No, unless you saw him in action. And you saw that with a certain witness that went through hell. And when we wanted to do things, he wouldn't let us do those things. But when the government wanted something, they got everything. They got everything they wanted. It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. And obviously he didn't do that. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. We had a DA who was a failed DA. Crime is rampant in New York, violent crime. That's what he's really supposed to be looking at. Crime is rampant in New York. Yesterday in McDonald's, you had a man hitting him up with machetes, a machete. Whoever can imagine even a machete being wielded in a store, in a place where they're eating, and he's going rampant. And Bragg is down watching a trial on what they call crimes. They're falsifying business records. That sounds so bad. To me, it sounds very bad. You know, it's only a misdemeanor, but to me, it sounds so bad. When they say falsifying business, that's a bad thing for me. I've never had that before. I'm falsifying. You know what falsifying business records is? In the first degree. They say falsifying business records. Sounds so good, right? It means that legal expense. I paid a lawyer, totally legal. I paid a lawyer a legal expense. And a bookkeeper, without any knowledge from me, correctly marked it down in the books. A very professional woman, highly respected, she testified. Marked it down in the books as a legal expense. So a legal expense, paid a lawyer, is a legal expense in the books. It's not sheetrock, construction, or any other thing. It's a legal expense. Think of that. This is what the falsification of business records were. And I said, what else are you going to call it? What else are you going to call it? Now, I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to. But the judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. In other words, you could go into every single thing that I ever did. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? And my lawyer said, what do you need to go through? And all you wanted to do is testify simply on this case. Because I would have loved to have testified. To this day, I would have liked to have testified. But you would have said something out of whack, like it was a beautiful sunny day and it was actually raining out. And I very much appreciate the big crowd of people outside. That's incredible what's happening. The level of support has been incredible. So the whole thing is legal expense was marked down as legal expense. Think of it. This is the crime that I committed, that I'm supposed to go to jail for 187 years for. When you have violent crime all over this city at levels that nobody's ever seen before, where you have businesses leaving, and businesses are leaving because of this, because heads of businesses say, man, we don't want to get involved with that. I could go through the books of any business person in this city, and I could find things that, in theory, I guess, let's indict him, let's destroy his life. But I'm out there, and I don't mind being out there, because I'm doing something for this country, and I'm doing something for our Constitution. It's very important, far beyond me. And this can't be allowed to happen to other presidents. It should never be allowed to happen in the future. But this is far beyond me. This is bigger than Trump. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than my presidency. And the people understand it, because I just see a poll just came out, the Daily Mail. That was the first one, came out, was done last night right after the verdict, where I'm up 6 points. 6 points from what we already were. We were leading fairly substantially. We're up 6 points in the Daily Mail poll. Now, maybe other polls come out and it says something differently. But a lot of people have predicted it, because the public understands, and they understand what's going on. This is a scam. There's a rigged trial. It shouldn't have been in that venue. We shouldn't have had that judge. He should have allowed us to have an election expert. We had the best expert, most respected expert, head of the Federal Elections Commission. He was all set to testify. He was waiting for 2 days. And when it was his turn, Bragg's people protested. And the judge knocked him out, said, you can't testify. He actually said you can't testify for anything having to do with the trial. You can say what the federal elections is. Well, that doesn't help. Everybody knows that. But you can't testify. So essentially, he wasn't able to testify. Other people weren't able to testify. But with these people, they were able to use people salacious. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened, and they know it. But they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. And do you notice the timing? The timing was perfect. This case was dead. It was dropped by every agency, every governmental board. It was dropped by the highly respected Southern District. They said, no, there's no case here. It was dropped by federal election, and that's what it's about. This is about a federal election, not a state election. You're not even allowed to look at it. They took the state and the city, and they went into a federal election. They're not allowed. The people from federal election, Southern District, and Washington dropped the case. Everybody dropped the case. There was no case. Cy Vance dropped the case. And when Bragg came in, he said, this is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen. And who would have a certain person, again, gag order, who would have a certain person like this ever testify? He said, this is essentially one of the worst people I've ever seen, ever, to testify. He said, the craziest case I've ever seen. This is Bragg. Then when I announced I was running for president, a long time later, they decided to revive this case. And they got a judge, Judge Marchand, who was responsible for another case that was also brought. It destroyed the life of a very good man, by the way. Destroyed the life of a very good man who went to prison once, and then they just put him in prison again because they said he lied. He didn't lie. I looked at the statements he made. In fact, he didn't remember something, and they put him in jail. Again, they've destroyed him. With me for many years, he was an honorable person. He was an honest man. And if you look at what he did, supposedly, it never happened. There's never been anything like this. Over the education of his grandchildren. Over, he didn't report that he had a car or 2 cars on his income. I don't know. I wonder how many people here have cars. I wonder how many people said, oh, gee, I have a car that's worth X dollars. How do you even figure it? And I guess you do have to report it, but I would say probably almost nobody does. Nobody even thinks about it. They put this man, they destroyed this man, but they put him in jail again because they didn't want him to testify. They didn't want him to testify. That's why he went to jail. They put him in jail twice. He's 77 years old. Now, normally I'd say that's an old guy, but I don't feel 77. Nobody ever says that about me. I'd like them to say, gee, we have to have a little sorrow for this man. Because they just don't say that about me, but maybe I'm better off that way. I think I'm probably better off that way. But they put him in jail twice. And you have to see what they put him in jail. And he was threatened by the judge. This man was told you're going to get 15 years in jail if you don't give up Trump. And he was told that. You're going to get 15 years in jail. And he made a plea deal because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life, and he was told that viciously. We're living in a fascist state. He was told that viciously. So you can go to jail for 4 months, 5 months, or you can get 15 years in jail. So do a plea. Almost who wouldn't do that plea? Everyone does those pleas. It's a horrible thing. There's a whole group of lawyers that fight that. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. But they destroyed his life. So many other things. You look at Southern District didn't want to bring the case. Nobody wanted to bring the case. And then you know who didn't want to bring the case most of all is Bragg. Bragg didn't want to bring it. But then he brought it. And they tried to make it a different case. They didn't say legal expense equal legal expense. Again, if I wrote down and paid a lawyer, and by the way, this was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But, you know, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that. Took me a while to find out. But he was effective. He did work. But he wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. You know, they like to use the word fixer. He wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. At the time, he was a fully accredited lawyer. Now, he got into trouble not because of me. He got into trouble because he made outside deals, and he had something to do with taxi cabs and medallions, and he borrowed money. And that's why he went. And then he pled to three election violations. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I wonder why he did that. He pled. He took a deal. Now, he took a deal because he wanted to get off. In other words, I'll take a plea deal and I want to get off. And he wanted to make a deal with the Southern District. And they wrote the worst report I think I've ever seen on any human being, other than the report that was written on James Comey by the Inspector General, a very great Inspector General, actually, wrote a report that was so bad. This one was possibly worse. The Southern District, the judge didn't let us use it. He said, it's hearsay. I said, it's not hearsay. Wouldn't let us use it. This is about the man. But he got in trouble for a very simple reason, because he was involved with borrowing a lot of money, and he did something with the banks. I don't know if it's defrauded the banks, but something happened. You guys know what it is. And then in addition to that, he gave up on three things where he wasn't guilty. In fact, they were going to testify in that. The head of the FEC, the Brad Smith, the election expert, #1 rated in the country, was going to testify. He took a plea on three things. He just added them in because that gave him more bargaining power with respect to me. But the three things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA. So we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal, a non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Everybody has them. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the people in this room have a non-disclosure agreement with their company. It's a disgrace. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal, totally common. Everyone has it. And what happened is he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this person, I guess other people, but it's totally honest. You're allowed to make the payment. You don't have to make it. You can make it any way you want. It's a non-disclosure agreement. And he signed that. And there was nothing wrong with signing it. And this should have been a non-case. And everybody said it was a non-case, including Bragg. Bragg said, until I ran for office. And then they saw the polls. I was leading the Republicans. I was leading the Democrats. I was leading everybody. And all of a sudden, they brought it back. It's a very sad thing that's happening in our country. And it's a thing that I'm honored. In a way, I'm honored. It's not that it's pleasant. It's very bad for family. It's very bad for friends and businesses. But I'm honored to be involved in it because somebody has to do it. And I might as well keep going and be the one. But I'm very honored to be involved because we're fighting for our Constitution. The money that was paid legally. There was nothing illegal. In fact, the lawyer in creating the NDA, because at that time he was a fully accredited lawyer. He wasn't a fixer. I never thought of him as a fixer. The media called him a fixer, or the prosecutors called him a fixer. He was a lawyer, and he was fairly good. Later on, I didn't like what he did. I didn't like, for instance, I didn't like that when I became president, he went around and made deals with companies. When I heard that, he was gone. He was gone. And he had payments coming to him, and a lot of this involved things that are very simple. There was nothing wrong. This was standard stuff, all standard stuff. Everything involved was standard. There was no crime here. In fact, I just watched a couple of the reports. You watched Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Greg Jarrett. You look at all of these people, Mark Levin, all very talented people, great people, many more. And they don't know me, essentially. They don't know me. They're legal scholars and experts. But I look at them. I watched Turley this morning saying, there's no crime here. Everybody says there's no crime here, except for this DA that's got the city out of control with crime. It's absolutely out of control. So we have an NDA that was signed. We have legal expenses. And here's the thing, on legal expenses, you have 100 where they say, they do a charge. I just recorded this out. Falsification of business records in the first degree. It sounds so bad. I said, wow. And even my own lawyers, I get very upset with them because they don't say what it is. They say, well, falsification of legal records is only a felony. Well, that's a lot. Is only a, they say, a misdemeanor. But they try and bring it up to a felony if there's 2 crimes. They have all these different things. The other thing is they missed the statute of limitations by a lot. Because this was very old. They could have brought this 7 years ago instead of bringing it right in the middle of the election. So they missed the statute of limitations. They did everything. Now, let me give you the good news. The good news is, last night, we just got a report this morning.
We are watching former President Donald Trump in his first lengthy remarks after being found guilty on 34 counts of document-related charges. This is taking place at Trump Tower. He began his remarks with what could actually be regarded as political remarks about various things that are part of the campaign, from immigration to car imports, but then has turned, of course, into the guilty verdict and his interpretation of the case, in some cases factually incorrect, which we'll get into in just a moment. We were told this was going to be a news conference. We are going to watch and wait and see if he takes questions in the meantime, and we'll continue, of course, to monitor his remarks. In the meantime, let me bring back Laura Jarrett, NBC News senior legal correspondent, Danny Savalos, also here, an NBC News legal analyst. A lot to parse through here, a lot of claims here. Let's pick one.
Let's start with the gag order.
Start with the gag order. He did make comments, obviously referencing Michael Cohen. I think most people would agree that's who he was discussing. Yeah. Michael Cohen still covered, and the former president certainly covered by this.
So the purpose of the gag order, remember, is to protect the witnesses from being attacked so that it doesn't influence their testimony. The purpose of the gag order is to be there in place for the duration of the trial. And when he was fined before for his violations of the gag order, it was for making references about Michael Cohen, similar to the types of things that we heard today. I'm interested to see whether, now that the trial has been completed, his attorneys actually asked for clarification to say, hey, Judge, is he still under the terms of this gag order until sentencing? Because there's an argument, I think, from the defense side to say, now the trial is over, he should be allowed to say whatever he wants. I could see the prosecutors pushing back on that in the event if, for any reason, they think there's still some witness intimidation. So I think that's an issue. We're going to reach out to the defense on their position. But he seems to be operating under the assumption that he is still under the gag order. He referred to himself as under it.
And we should note he also has repeated several times that he still wanted to testify, talking about the jeopardy that most lawyers will advise you that if you put yourself out there. But again, maintaining that he wanted all along to testify. Another point I think we have to deal with is he repeated the claim that this is all the result of President Biden or the White House, Democratic operatives who've made this happen. This was a state prosecution.
A state case indicted by a state grand jury, and now a grand jury, now a jury of 12 in New York finding him guilty. This was not a decision reached by a judge. This is not a decision reached by prosecutors, certainly. This was a decision reached by a jury with no connection, no discernible connection to the White House or the Justice Department. It's a claim that he's tried to surmount for political reasons throughout this trial. And
Danny, let me ask you, he also went into a very long defense of criticism of the trial and and what they wanted and what they didn't get. He said the government got everything it wanted in terms of requests to the judge. Is that a fair characterization?
No, not exactly. I mean, the defense won some points throughout the trial, but one of his main complaints, for example, is that they weren't able to call an election law expert. But even his own attorneys had to know that was going to be a challenge to get that expert on the stand. Because while you can call experts on issues that are beyond the average knowledge of a juror, like blood spatter experts, firearms experts, fingerprints, things like that, something like an issue of law, and Justice Merchan said as much, is an issue that the judge will instruct the jury on. You can't call generally an expert to tell jurors what the law is. That is the province of the judge. And that's why the judge did not preclude that expert. Right. The judge instead limited the scope of testimony of that expert. And Donald Trump just acknowledged as much, saying that there were areas that he would have been able to testify about. They made a strategic decision and decided not to call the expert.
But is all this par for the course in a typical criminal trial?
Absolutely. You don't get to call experts to discern and to try to decipher the law. That's for the judge to do.
Right. You can't call an expert to say and qualify the expert as he may in fact be an expert and qualified as an expert, but you can't turn to him and then say, tell the jury what the law is and tell the jury that what the defendant did was in fact lawful. That is literally what the purpose of the jury instructions are. That is why they are instructed. And that's exactly what the judge said. Maybe not verbatim, but essentially, I will instruct the jury on the law. Therefore, these are the limited areas that your expert can go into.
He also talked about this case being only a misdemeanor. In fact, it was boosted to a felony, correct?
Boosted to a felony in this case. And we should be clear that the way that they sort of attach their wagon in this case to a felony is novel. We have not seen that before. We have seen plenty of falsification of business records cases in New York and other places. But the way that they went about it by sort of latching it to a federal violation of campaign laws, that is novel. That is untested. And it hasn't been done before. And it's one of the reasons that he's right that many prosecutors didn't want to bring this case, including prosecutors in this very office in Manhattan. But they ultimately decided that they thought that they could bring it. They thought that it was valid. They thought that it was legal. And he's also right. The prosecutors in the Southern District of New York did not bring this case, but he's wrong about why. The reason they didn't bring it is because he was president at the time. And so they couldn't prosecute a sitting president.
All right, let's bring in some guests who have worked for both the Republicans and Democrat administrations. Hogan Gidley worked for Mr. Trump's White House as former White House Deputy Press Secretary, and Simone Sanders Townsend. She's a former senior member of the Biden-Harris administration and served as chief spokesperson to Vice President Kamala Harris. Appreciate all of you joining us. Hogan, let me begin with you. What we have seen so far is the former president doing himself any favors?
Well, what he's doing is trying to defend himself against what he deems a rigged process. We will see this play out over the course of the next several days and weeks. But we're talking about a town, New York City, in which they've never met a felony. They didn't want to downgrade to a misdemeanor. And in this particular trial, they wanted to make a misdemeanor into a felony. So I understand his rationale and his reasoning there. What it will help with him, though, is something he said, I think right after or right before you cut away, is when he pointed out 34 different counts here. In just 12 hours, he's raised $35 million off of this. Many people in this country deem this as an unfair proceeding. Forget the party, forget your political persuasion. So many people want fairness, and they don't deem this case as having been conducted fairly. That's what Donald Trump's talking about right here. Of course, he's going to talk about issues, as you pointed out, right off the top. But right now, he is trying to explain to the people what he thinks happened in this case and why he's been unfairly targeted. And that's going to be the battle from now until Election Day.
He's not allowed under the gag order to really go or make comments about the jury, but you are. Many others have called this, again, a sham trial. Is that not a direct repudiation of the work of the jury? How do you account for the fact that 9 hours they were able to look through this evidence and make the decision they did?
Well, it's Manhattan, so they don't like him here. That's pretty obvious, and a lot of people will call them a jury of his peers. Okay, I would argue it's a jury of his political opponents because they don't like him. The judge doesn't like him, and quite frankly, when I talk to reporters in the room who lean left, whose names you would know, national reporters at big entities, called me and said it was obvious the judge didn't like him and the jury didn't like him either. No one is surprised by this outcome.
Let me bring in Simone Sanders, again, former chief spokesperson spokesperson for Vice President Harris. Simone, give me your thoughts about, we keep hearing about the weaponization of the judicial system. How will the Biden campaign deal with this going forward in terms of how much they can talk about and how much they want to walk past?
So I think you're going to hear two things. And first, let me back up and say that, prior to my political career, I spent a lot of time doing juvenile justice, criminal justice reform work. And so in that work, there are many people that will criticize a system that is proven to be disproportionately unfair to a number of different individuals, a lot of times Black and brown, young people, young men and women. And I don't think inherently criticism of a system is a degradation of the system. That being said, we all watched and covered, and I know Laura and Danny are sitting there at that table with you, Lester, this trial, and saw how, frankly, the system bent over backwards to ensure that the former president received a fair and impartial trial. Judge Marchand from the bench multiple times noted, I am not going to decide if he's guilty or not. That is up for the jury to do. I think you're going to hear the Biden campaign and Democrats writ large lean into that piece of it, that this was a trial that went forward. This was not something that the Justice Department, that Biden himself ordered, as people are saying. We all saw this play out, reading it with our eyes, watching it with our own eyes, hearing it with our own ears, and now the jury has spoken, and Donald Trump did not take the stand. I think you're going to hear many of those things from Democrats, and you're going to hear from the Biden campaign, and I think President Biden and the Vice President more specifically, about just tying this into their argument about democracy, and this on top of other issues. It is not enough for the Democrats to just talk about Donald Trump's legal troubles. Lester, there are many people out there that did not realize that even though Donald Trump has now been convicted of 34 felonies, he is still on the ballot. There are none of these court cases that are going to bar him from being able to run for president or, frankly, even be elected president. The only thing that is going to keep Donald Trump from being the next president of the United States is what people do at the ballot box come this fall. And that is something, in my talking to Democrats over the last 24 hours, that we're going to hear them hammer home.
Simone, let me ask you, is this good for Democrats? And when I say is this, not just the verdict, but even the trial, the fact that this case was brought, is it helpful or does it hurt Democrats in the long term?
I would say neither, Lester. It's not about if it's helpful for Democrats or if it's hurtful for Democrats. Frankly, people bring trials and cases happen because do people do crimes or not? And so the question is, did Donald Trump engage in activity that a grand jury found credible to say that he should be charged? And we know that the answer to that question is yes. And then a jury of 12 folks decided that he was guilty of not just one felony count, but 34. So for Democrats, I don't think it benefits them to get into the nitty-gritty of the weeds of the minutia of his trials or not. The point is, Donald Trump has now been convicted of 34 felonies. He can say whatever he wants about those felonies, but the paper does not lie. So our Republicans have to make a decision about what they're going to do about that. And Democrats need to not downplay it, right? Because this is very serious. The United States now joins other Western countries, such as France, such as Italy, as Israel, right, who have charged and gone through trials for the current and former presidents. This is not unusual for the Western world. It is unusual for America. So this shouldn't be downplayed, but this is not going to win them an election in November, and I think Democrats know that.
And Hogan, Mr. Trump continues to make the allegation that this is all being driven by the Biden White House, that he's pulling the strings behind the curtain. Is that something? Is that a narrative that you have adopted, or is it strictly what Mr. Trump is saying?
Well, I would imagine a lot of Republicans are going to adopt this in large part because in the other cases, too, you see a lot of back and forth with the prosecutors going to the White House, having conversations, et cetera.
Right, but we've seen it here.
Yeah, but even in the press conference right after this, Alvin Bragg was flanked by the number 3 person from the DOJ. So it's legitimate for the president to say, wait a minute, does Biden know anything about this? Was there any communication? And some of your other legal panelists were pointing out the fact that the head of the FEC was not allowed to testify. And they made arguments for that, right or wrong. I'm not sure. I'm not an attorney. What I do know, though, is that Michael Cohen was allowed to testify on whether or not Donald Trump broke the law. He was able to assess whether he thought federal election rules were violated. But the defense couldn't mount the same argument. But Simone is right about so much of this because it's not about this case. I think a lot of this has been baked into the final product. It's about the issues that the American people want addressed: the wide open southern border, spiking crime, drugs pouring into their communities, an economy where you can't afford gas and groceries. Those are all laid squarely at the feet of Joe Biden. The American people have been kicked in the teeth by those failed policies now for 4 years, and the Democrats would rightly understand that this latest knock on Donald Trump, this latest attempt to finally get him, is probably going to backfire, and it won't amount to much moving forward in this campaign.
Hogan, thanks very much. We should note, of course, there is no evidence that the Biden administration is behind any of this. Let me turn to Laura. You were shaking your head at one point.
Just briefly, we should just be clear that what Michael Cohen was there to testify about was the alleged conspiracy. As he said, he agreed with the former president to do this. He was not there to opine on the law. He was not there to say that that there was an actual violation of law in his opinion as a lawyer. He was there to say what we did together, what we conspired to do together, broke the law. That was just a small distinction I think we should make. He was not there as a lawyer in that capacity.
Michael Cohen was a fact witness,
yes,
and he would never have been qualified as an expert on election law. And really, he's talking about his awareness of whether or not what he is doing is criminal. That's not the same as describing what is and what is not illegal under the law. It's a totally different area of testimony. Expert testimony versus percipient factual witness testimony. That's what Michael Cohen was. And he's the farthest thing from a legal expert because, of course, he's not even a lawyer anymore. So that's not his role. It was never his role. He was a fact witness.
And Laura, we heard from Todd Blanche earlier today, kind of giving the outlines of what they might base an appeal on. Did anything he said surprise you?
Well, there's plenty, I think. There's plenty of fertile ground here. As we mentioned, they've raised statute of limitations issues. They've raised issues with the fact that Stormy was allowed to testify at length about an alleged sexual encounter that was salacious, which they say obviously never happened, and the former president again denied it again today. I think that's a ripe ground for an appeal in terms of prejudice. We might also see the fact, again, the way they sort of hooked this misdemeanor to another misdemeanor to make a felony had never been done in the way that they did it in this case, and all of that can be grounds for an appeal. All of that is going to take weeks, if not months, if not more than a year.
We're going to go back to Trump Tower. Hallie Jackson is standing by. Hallie, this was billed as a news conference. It was something a bit less than that. Describe what's just happened.
It was not that. It was a statement. It was a speech, essentially, by former President Trump delivered to members of the media who have assembled here on this historic day. I want to give you some context of the room here. If you heard cheering and clapping, it came from a group of supporters who were inside Trump Tower. Outside, you have another group of Trump supporters who are holding signs. One of them, for example, says Trump or death. But inside here, I couldn't help but think, Lester, as I listened to the former president speak, that in some ways this is what we may have heard to a degree if he had taken the stand and testified in his own behalf. I know you've done some fact checking there back at the studio at 30 Rock, but the former president had the opportunity to do so. He said he would have loved to. Again, he chose not to, but you heard him try to make his case, a case that the jury firmly and clearly rejected with those verdicts, guilty verdicts on those 34 counts here. This was, in some ways, the Donald Trump that I have covered and we have all covered here for many years. It was an airing of the grievances. If this trial in many ways has been a trip down memory lane dating back to 2016 and earlier, this was former President Trump ticking through his issues with, for example, his previous impeachments, his time in office, going after President Biden in a way that we often hear at his campaign rallies, Lester. So more to come here. But the former president did one thing here, Mr. Trump. He cast the stakes of this election, saying that November 5th, Election Day, is going to be the most important day in American history. Lester.
Hallie Jackson, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com, and a full wrap-up tonight when I see you back here for nightly.